Good morning, everybody. It's Friday.
Hey.
We reached another end of our week. This is episode 84, and we have a guest today. But first, we'll introduce ourselves and then introduce our guest, who you should all recognize because he's been here before. I'm Mark Van Sunik. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And yeah, we're excited to have Gus back. Yeah, Gus, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Gus Kroll. I am one of the co-leaders at Home PDX, which is an on-the-ground support organization for folks who live outside. I am also the secretary of the board at Sisters of the Road, which is a revolutionary anti-homelessness cafe in Portland, which hopes to one day just be the best damn cafe in Portland, Oregon.
Worthy aspiration.
I mean, any organization that isn't working to put itself out of business in this line of work are just the worst.
Nice. I hear you. Maybe to kind of frame things, like why are we talking about this? Why is it important? Like even particularly in this moment. Yesterday we talked about the rise of fascism, and we've been talking about things the way that the pandemic, the rise of fascism, this kind of coming ecological collapse, this late stage consumer capitalism, this crisis moment we're in. Usually when we talk about this stuff, there are people who are centered more in the narrative and people are pushed to the outside. And folks who experience homelessness usually are kind of just forgotten about. And all these protests happening, police brutality, all these issues that matter to us a lot today affect people experiencing homelessness disproportionately. And, beforehand, I just shared an anecdote and I want to share it now as a kind of a framing thing. Back in the day, so for 15 years, I led and co-founded an intentional community that offered housing to different folks in transition. And so there were often people coming in and out. We'd had church services. People would come in and out who weren't there for church, but they were like, they needed food or whatever. And so we had some guests at the time who were pretty solid Marxists who stopped coming. And so I asked them why they stopped coming. And they said, well, your church services felt a little bit too much like a flop house. And so I pressed them and asked what the deal was. And they said it just had kind of a homeless vibe, a little bit too lumpen, is the word he used. Now, in Marxist speak, the lumpen proletariat is the layer underneath the proletariat. And so the proletariat, the working class, drives revolution. But the lumpen, according to a lot of
just Marxist like thinking, lump.
Are just a lump. They just don't do anything, and they, you care about them, you want them to be provided for, but they don't have any revolutionary potential in and of themselves. Of course, Frantz Fanon later on, who important thinker, people need to read that stuff, said no, the so-called wretched of the earth are the driving force of revolution too. And so it's important, like in all these conversations around justice, the idea that we don't just have to do stuff for the homeless because they need our help, but that we can center struggle around their experience in a way where they can even take the lead and set a tone, I think is very important in this crisis moment we're in. And so Gus has some things to share about that. And I think it's important. It's absolutely important to think about unions in particular, not just as groups of workers at a factory, but a gathering of people using leverage to struggle against injustice, and that in some way that is tied up to economic justice. So that's a little bit of a reframing. And I'm just going to toss the ball over to you, Gus, if you want to springboard off of that.
Yeah. So as Mark and Daniel and I were talking about earlier, I think it's helpful to think, or I suppose the place to start would maybe be the National Union of the Homeless, which was started in Philadelphia in 1983 by three homeless guys, one of whom was a former organizer with a hospital workers union. And so it was a, like, how do we organize people who are outside of, the working class? Like, or how do we organize people whose kind of primary intersection, like their main thing, their main struggle is not as a worker, but is around their housing, is around their, like that's the big odious thing in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't, yeah. And so it ended up growing to be, I think at its height, it had something like 25 locals nationally. It had, I think it was close to 50,000 union members, sometimes dues paying, which has this interesting aspect of creating buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I paid, my $5 annual membership fee, like I own this thing, like this thing is mine. But it's also like a very, very small cash, a revenue driver, which is also important when you're talking about a thing like a group that's advocating for homeless people by homeless people. So yeah. And then I also think it's important to reframe or to frame homeless unions as being part of a larger movement of welfare unions. We were talking a little bit about this before. So in the 1950s, really through the 70s, and then petering off after that, there were a number of different welfare unions. You can pick up, you can easily Google a gal named Johnny Tillman. In the first issue of Ms. Magazine, she has an article, a piece called Welfare is a Women's Issue. And she was organizing, along with a number of other people, folks on welfare around, and one of the things that they did would do membership drives around the things that people who are on welfare are due. So your state may say, like, you are due a pair of shoes per person in the house per year. And it's like, do you have a pair of shoes? Have you gotten your new coat this year? No? Well, here's the piece of paper that you have to, fill out. We're all going to go down to the welfare office together, and we're going to get ourselves the things that we need. And that was really effective. But one of the reasons that we don't see this as a well-remembered part of this history is because folks on welfare, folks who are homeless, aren't really great at archiving. Where would you archive the stuff anyway? Right. Kids from Stanford who are organizing at the same time for SDS or whatever, those folks have, they're learning how to do archiving. They're learning how to write papers, how to take effective meeting minutes, all of these things. It's a very different thing. And it's a lot harder to write a history, coming out of these sorts of movements. And I think that's part of the reason that it doesn't get a lot of airplay, besides just nobody cares about, the folks who are on the bottom, regardless of whether you're on the left or the right.
Right. Yeah. And of course, these lines of, who's a worker, who's a lumpen person, all of these designations, particularly in this late stage capitalism, are really starting to get blurred because, a huge percentage of people who are outdoors are working.
Yeah.
And Gus, you probably know the statistics about this, far better than I do. But right now, this is going to become incredibly relevant because, the estimates are that there's up to 30 million people in America that are potentially facing becoming homeless in the next several months due to the economic collapse of the pandemic. Now, that is a boatload of people. And again, those are all folks that just, 6 months ago were very much a part of the working middle class, or even, maybe slightly upper middle class. And so, you just have this entire segment of our population that is simply being crushed by the capitalist reality that we are all facing, and the lack of centering of care, period, that is part of our society.
Well, and in addition to those factors that you just mentioned, Dan, there's also, we're seeing wildfires, we're seeing hurricanes. We know we've been warned for years now about the coming ecological refugee situation where places become unlivable, and that's going to happen here. At the same time, jobs, like unions were at their strongest when you could, be working at the Hormel plant like my grandpa, and you could still get a pension, which isn't a thing anymore as much as it used to be. And so there's been this rise of reframing, so the proletariat, we need to talk about the precariat, that group of people who work, but there's no sense of solidity or stabilization with their work. And so they're always having to bounce around. All these conditions come together. The line between middle class and homeless is really thin compared to the way it used to be. And even that was the historical anomaly. So it's important to think about, I remember after Occupy, there was this growth of student debtor unions, which didn't really catch on. And this brings up another reason why I think some of these groups don't get centered enough, is if you're a worker fighting for better wages, people think, well, that's, you work hard. That's good for you. If you're a student who's trying to renegotiate debt with a block of other people, they're like, you're selfish bastards, or homeless people, or people who want better welfare. It's like, you should be grateful for what crumbs you get. Get away from me, dog. There's a little bit of that mentality baked into anything where it's not you advocating for better pay for your work.
Yeah. And that's a whole.
Go ahead, Dan.
Guess. No,
I was just going to say, all right. I was going to say, I think there's also a secondary problem that you're hinting at, Mark, which is what I've heard people talk about as being the student government problem, which is people graduate, and this is a real problem for any, homeless organizing group, which is that it's really hard to keep kind of elders engaged in the struggle, as they move on to have other problems. If I go from being just the crack homeless organizer while I'm outside, and I move inside, there might be, an inclination to move from organizing around housing to organizing around tenancy. Maybe I move in the direction of doing, a tenants union. Maybe I, start organizing at work. And so, I think it's, as we see people graduate from homelessness, and sometimes they're just graduating to different places. A lot of the low-income housing in the Portland metro where I live is not downtown, which is where, the vast concentration of homeless folks are. That's a problem.
And it's interesting that you mentioned this, Gus, and I'd never thought about this until just this minute, but, I wonder if in some ways this kind of phenomenon has contributed to the collapse of the organizing and labor movement in general, right? Which is that, when you had a large percentage of the population that did just have one job in one company for their whole life, it's a lot easier to organize for the long term. Whereas now we know that people jump from job to job to job, have 4, 5, 6 careers in their lives. And so obviously, if they do some organizing at job number 1, by the time they've jumped to job number 3 or career number 3, they're going to be very disconnected from that initial setting. But we've got some good comments and questions coming up here.
I'll start with a comment from CK from before the episode started. He writes, our family lives in the Stevens Square community, which is about a mile from here, and rents with Mint Properties. Our ceiling has flooded our living room 6 times in a year and a half. We pay our rent on time or in advance when we can. They have done nothing to correct the problem upstairs in the bathroom and now have told us that if we don't like it, we can move. Mint Properties retaliates against the renters. Trying to get help is too expensive. Mint United is trying to organize, but the reality is you will not be rented, or it goes from there. But yeah, this is the question. So the leverage piece. So in an economy like a lot of cities, but Minneapolis is on this sort of more expensive than most, but not as expensive as some of the big areas. But rent is becoming untenable. And so now the leverage is almost entirely in the hands of the landlords, because they can just kick people out if they cause problems, and they have plenty of people waiting in line. So it's a great example of how do you find leverage as a group of people who are being exploited.
Well, and I just feel like this is something that I just don't think that I hear enough about in terms of this issue of gentrification and property, is that if you put housing, and this is true about any basic need, right? It's a problem about food, it's a problem about healthcare, it's a problem about education. If you put any of these things in a capitalist economy, and you then have all of your political parties completely in favor of capitalism and a capitalist economy and not questioning that at all, and you then slap a very regressive tax on that item. I mean, property tax is probably the most regressive tax that there is, because it has nothing to do with the economics of the people who are living in houses. You are always going to get this phenomenon, right? You are always going to get some kind of gentrification. You are always going to get people who are on the margins pushed out of that resource. And that, until you sort of get at that very directly, it's really hard to get around this issue and the kind of problems that CK and tons of folks are experiencing.
Yeah.
Can I get a little grumpy for a second?
Yes.
Go wild.
But I've noticed this though. So we could have an episode where we talk about fascism or how Trump's an idiot, and we'll get tons of viewers. And I noticed that our viewership is about a third of what normal is. And this happened last time we talked about homelessness. Now, I get it. It doesn't affect all of us, and it's not a fun thing to talk about. But this is part of the thing. So I don't want to scold anyone individually, but this is a microcosm that happens at large.
You can
scold the people who are actually watching.
Yeah, yes. So if people are watching, I don't want to say oh, if you're not watching this one, but you watch other ones, you suck. But there's generally there's a trend here. And the trend points to a larger social issue where we don't think what happens to homeless people really affects us directly that much. And so this is an example of okay, that may be true at a certain number of levels, but folks organizing around these welfare issues really has a huge impact on everyone, unless you're some sort of wealthy person who's exploiting the hell out of everyone else. We need to center our movements and activities around these groups who are on the front edge of fighting for basic rights, because we as a society are lacking in that department, and that affects a lot of people. So for all those who aren't watching, my psychic energy is going out into the ether.
So everybody that is watching, go get 5 of your friends and beat on them and tell them that they should be watching.
And I think you look at there was a piece The Nation did maybe 2 years ago on Rochester. So Rochester, I mean, I don't know how they haven't been super active, at least that I've seen, on social media. I mean, which is where I'm getting a lot of my news on this, because nobody is reporting on it. Like it's not a huge story. But I mean, Rochester had, at least at one point, had an old folks union that was organizing within old folks homes. They had a tenants union, and they had a homeless union, all within Rochester. And these groups were working together because
New York.
Yeah. And like I said, you should be able to, a quick internet search should pull up the Nation article I'm talking about. These groups were working together because these issues are interrelated. Like,
Right.
If old folks who are in old folks homes, like they don't have a whole lot of other options.
Right.
And folks who are organizing within a shelter, like there's a big threat there. Like if I'm organizing within a shelter, the mission, whoever runs your local version of the mission, like if I'm organizing there, like I'm risking my housing.
Yeah.
Like it may be awful housing, but I mean, for some people, it's worth the trade-off of all of the awful that comes with it.
Mm-hmm.
No.
So some more comments here.
Yeah.
Julia writes, been seeing people experiencing homelessness exploited and abused by likes of phony charities like Invisible People run by a real creepy guy. I mean, this is the other thing. There's this whole industrial complex, the charity industrial complex. And this, there's a couple of problems with it. One is this framework of charity versus like empower and advocacy is one piece of it. But then also the way in which there's a reason that a lot of my friends who have experienced homelessness hate going to shelters. It's because they're not safe, and there's all kinds of loaded shit with these services where it's easy for these services that are supposed to provide for people can exploit and take advantage of situations too. So there's
what I will respond directly to Julia's comment though. Like I know Invisible People, like regardless of what you think of Mark Horvath, I think his name is. I mean, he also has lived experience. Like, he spent, I think, close to a decade living outside. And so, I mean, like, you can disagree with him. You can think he's a creep. Like, okay. Like, I do think and the other thing I like about his organization, again, like you cannot like it, that's your prerogative, is he spends a lot of time centering, people who are directly experiencing homelessness's voice. Like he points, he has a camera, he does interviews with folks. If folks don't want to do the interview, he at least claims he'll just walk away. And so, like, I think the idea of, like, giving someone 5 minutes to kind of, like, tell me about your reality. Like, what would you like people to know about you and your experience? Mm-hmm. Like, there's some power to that. Like, there's some power to not having some Yahoo like me kind of be the gatekeeper. And I think, again, like, that's the thing that's powerful about a union, in my mind, is that it's like there's a phrase, and I keep wanting to say it's Frederick Douglass, but I don't think it is, about those who are suffering know when their pain has been lifted. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important concept. Like having, as you already said, Mark, people who are experiencing the problem in the driver's seat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Series writes, what are ways people who are housed can do the inner and outer work of being a better comrade to the various homeless housing communities and individuals? there's a lot of tendencies in many housed working and middle class folks tend to project means testing and patronizing downward mobility race to the bottom view in very puritanical ways towards the houseless folks. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this idea of like part of the reason I think a lot of people don't want homeless people or poor folks in general to be behind the driver's seat is because we assume that they're in that situation because they suck.
Yeah.
That's part of the dominant American myth. Like, well, why would you be you can't drive. Let someone middle class drive, at least, or wealthy is even better because they're more successful.
And that's actually Frances Fox Piven's argument in her book that I forget what it's called, Poor People's Movements. She has a chapter where she covers the welfare unions, but her general thesis of the book, at least if I recall correctly, is that you need somebody who's got a little bit of like who's not feeling the brunt of all of this trash. Like they're not taking it right in the face because that's and I mean, like, there's a point, like, if you're dealing with the cops telling me to move along, like, every day, like, it's hard to organize in that.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, directly to Suri's comment, I mean, you got to ask people. Again, only the person who's experiencing the pain can tell you when that pain's, being fixed. Like we wouldn't trust a doctor who didn't ask, like, does that feel better or worse? Like, like we've seen how that plays out among like Black patients. Like that ends up in the news all the time about how, white doctors tend not to listen to their patients, saying like, actually the pain is getting worse. Like it's not going away. And that's a serious problem.
Yep.
The other part is, I think if your community has an organization that is mobilizing around homelessness, there's a researcher named Daniel Kress who wrote a paper called what is it called? Mobilizing at the Margins. And one of the things that he identifies as being a key indicator for whether or not groups survive just a year is having a benefactor, having some sort of like group that is supporting them. But at the same time, the more often that they have a benefactor, the less likely they are to be militant. And so finding like that balance between like, how do I support these organizations? And I mean, this is the same conversation about Black Lives Matter. Like, how do you support an organization while at the same time, sometimes they might say like, no, like looting is valid. Like, this isn't a riot, this is an uprising. Like, and that makes some of us really, really uncomfortable, but it also is a really, really effective way to make change happen, not incrementally, but now.
Yeah. What, before we wrap up here, I we've talked some about the economic piece to all of this and some of the attitudinal issues, and I just want to tie in another thread here, which is mental health. The folks living outdoor population has grown dramatically since the deinstitutionalization in the 1980s, and there was all this promise about community mental health work that was going to go on, most of which was left totally unfulfilled. And you then had many folks being transferred literally or over time or intermittently to the prison industrial complex. And so, you know, and again, to me, if you think about how we don't really want to talk about mental health in our society, and that's tied into all kinds of weird religious ideas, and, you know, if you've got mental health problems, you're not being faithful enough, and all kinds of crazy like that. You know, then it's also not surprising that folks who are experiencing homelessness, in part because of mental health issues that there's no help for, how that all interconnects as well. And so that's a big part of this.
There's so many interconnections. Like another one, I mean, just one we can tack on right to the end is the way that like domestic violence plays into this. Like, so there was an article that came out in one of the weeklies here in Portland just a couple of years ago, where they were saying that it was the lion's share of women who were on the street in the Portland metro came out of abusive relationships. Like that was their last housing situation. And I mean, like, and so then they end up in positions where, like, you know, like nobody cares about them. And so I know a lot of women who end up in positions where, like, having a dude around means no one will rape me. And so maybe I'm ending up settling for this guy. Like I'm ending up in this like survival sex situation where I'm trading willingly trading sex for protection. Like, so I won't get raped, you know, and it's awful. There's so many of these intersections.
Yeah. Same is true for, you know, teenagers who are queer, trans folks, all kinds of stuff. Maybe we could just blaze through a couple of these other comments, and because as usual, we're out of time.
Past time. CK was underscoring a point that was made earlier. Organization while being evicted makes it even harder. The organizing series writes, it does not help that we normalize compartmentalization and politics of resentment and scarcity in our advocacy for basic needs. That's a big one. Resentment is a huge driving force in modern politics, which sucks. CK writes, there's an artist union in Rhode Island who are occupying abandoned wheelhouses.
Cool.
Maybe I'm wondering if that's warehouses. Kathleen, this is a final comment for today. Here in Kansas City, we have homeless people in camps under bridges. The police constantly force them to move. The camps just pop up again a few blocks away. One group is near my house. I admit that it makes me a little nervous.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it.
Yeah. No, it's very reasonable. And of course, we're, you know, we're seeing that in Minneapolis now. Folks are being moved from park to park to park to park, you know, and
That's every city in America right now.
Right.
But to CK's comment, really quick, the one thing I can say, recommend, if you're organizing around tenant unions or tenancy, pay attention to if the company that manages your property, if they ever forget to blind CC people. So if they send out an email and there are more people on that email than just you, be sure to forward that to your tenant union, because they've just done the organizing for you. Like they've just connected you with other people who are in the same position as you, and like they're dumb.
Yeah, and CK, one of the things I've done is I put the Facebook page of a group, and you may be familiar with them, this group that's been doing all this great organizing that I mentioned before, and it's possibly a resource. And Catherine, as a final remark.
Haven't been commenting because I'm soaking up all the useful info. Would love to hear another session on this intersection of homelessness and different forms of organizing. It feels key. Agreed.
All right. Well, Gus, thanks so much for coming on again. And it's great to see you. And the robot birds are very happy that we are all together.
I think they're upset.
They might be upset.
They're reporting back to the lizard people.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. All right.
Well,
oh, there's the cat. Bye, kitty.
See everybody on Monday.